Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity. There is much more Bulgarian than simply my passport, which means that to a certain extent, the book itself was very much trying to give some East European perspective on part of the crisis that we are going through. So I'm just the opposite of what you're going to call the inspirational speaker. So from this point of view, I'm much more going to come with questions than answers. And secondly, unfortunately, I hope at least that I'm not part of this crowd which is better at explaining than understanding what is happening. I'm not going to try to summarize the major argument of the book. I'll try to do something slightly different. And this is to try to reflect on something that I believe is the paradox of 2017. And let's state it in the beginning and after that give my reading of it. And the paradox is the following. We all, also looking at the figures, including public opinion polls, has the feeling that there is a confidence, back on track, there is a kind of a genuine sense of optimism. And this optimism came, nevertheless, that none of the four crises that I'm going to address, neither the Euro crisis, nor the Russia-Ukrainian conflict, no Brexit, no migration crisis, in fact, have been solved. And my question is, what are the sources of this optimism? And secondly, what we should basically fear talking about it. When it comes to the future of Europe, I remember in 1990, 1991, the United States has a vice president who probably nobody has a reason to remember. His name is Dan Quayle, but he coined a great phrase. He said, "The future will be better tomorrow." And I do believe that probably this is true. What I'll start first is going to say that the four crises that I mentioned, all of them, challenge some of the fundamental assumptions on which the European Union is based. Let's start with the Euro crisis. And I'm not an economist, and in the presence of Daniel, I'm not going to speculate anything on this. But there are four things that came as a result of the financial crisis, which is a legacy to be challenged. First, if you read in the opinion polls, one of the major impact of the crisis was that there is no certainty anymore that the next generation is going to have, in economic terms, life better than the current generation. You have a youth that starts in Western Europe to envy their parents. And this is a new moment. The second, European Union was perceived as a convergence machine. A poor country enter, and not simply that they're becoming richer, but they're becoming less poor compared with the richest countries. As a result of the financial crisis, this is not true anymore. Not about Eastern Europe, but about Southern Europe. In a certain way, the crisis acts as a divergent machine. What we normally talk about elites, that this is the crisis that makes the rich richer, this is also true for countries. Germany, now and in 10 years, is going to be as better, for example, than Greece, compared the same in the moment when Greece entered compared to West Germany. So the convergence moment is not there anymore. And I do believe this is a huge story, particularly if you try to see the legitimacy of the European Union from some of the periphery countries. The third, which comes with the crisis, was, of course, the change of the relationship between the North and South as the relations between creditors and debtors. And the problem with the creditors and debtors, unlike rich and poor, is that it's power relations. Creditors and debtors are not politically equal because one depends very much on others. So why I'm saying all this? I'm saying because nevertheless that you have economic growth. And I know that President Juncker is convinced that it's enough to have economic growth and all the problems are going to disappear. All these problems are going to stay. And even institutionally, which we heard on the previous panel, the institutional reform that was meant to prevent the repetition of the Euro crisis is not completed. Imagine for the moment, and this is not so unimaginable, that Italian elections are going to make markets nervous, that there are going to be pressure on Italian banks, that there are going to be pressure on the Euro system again. To what extent, basically, this sense of economic optimism is going to remain? Then we're going to the Russia-Ukrainian crisis. And the Russia-Ukrainian crisis was By the way, it was perceived very differently in different parts of the world. Europe does not have the common security strategy. But the Russia-Ukrainian crisis challenged two of the major assumptions in which European foreign policy is based. First, that military power doesn't matter. It matters. And it matters also in Europe. And this is why we're talking about the new defense and security policies. Secondly, there was the assumptions that economic interdependence by its own is going dramatically to reduce the risk of war. But what historians were telling us all these years is that economic interdependence is really reducing the risk of war if the trading partners has a positive expectations from the future. If the trading partners has a negative expectations about the future, economic interdependence can increase the risk of war. So from this point of view, I do believe that it's not simply that European Union see the rise of other powers, and not simply that we have been challenged in this or other region of the world, and not simply the crisis of the relations with the United States after the last elections, but our very understanding that the world is moving in our direction when it comes to understanding of peace and power have been challenged. And then we go with Brexit, and I'm even not going to comment on the 50 billion per year, which Minister Pavlova already quoted. But Brexit was very important psychologically, because European Union was done and in a certain way organized on the principle of the Catholic marriage. There is no divorce. This is a union created that nobody is leaving. And this was part of the strength of the union. And then suddenly, United Kingdom left, and United Kingdom is not any country. The problem with the United Kingdom leaving is not simply the size of the country and not simply most of the other important role that United Kingdom was playing, but also you have the oldest democracy in Europe living with a popular vote, thus by this questioning the democratic legitimacy of the European Union. On the conferences, we easily can solve the democratic legitimacy question, but at the end of the day, when you have the Brits doing this, the problem of the question of the democratic legitimacy comes big. And then, of course, you have the migration crisis, and in my book there was a lot on this, and my major argument is, in a way, very simple. Migration crisis and the refugee crisis of 2015-16 is not so important because of the number of the people that entered European Union. The number of the people that entered European Union is not mind-blowing. We are talking about less than 1% of the population of the European Union. And by the way, they ended in a very few countries. The problem with the migration crisis is like with the 9/11 in the United States, where 3,000 people being killed in New York is a tragedy, but this is not the biggest tragedy in the number of the victims you can imagine. But it forced Europeans to see the world with different lens. As a result of it, migration crisis dramatically changed the national political dynamics, both in the crises that have been affected by migration and also countries which didn't get a single migrant. And from this point of view, I do believe this is one of the most profound crises which we are seeing because of this political impact that we have. And here, of course, came the particular problem of Central and Eastern Europe. Because for somebody staying in Germany, what happened with the position of the Central Europeans was just a scandal. They said, you have all these countries, people that have been refugees and emigrating for the last 70 years. You have all these people that have basically benefiting from membership in the European Union, and now, nevertheless, that they don't have much refugee in their countries, they have been so reluctant to show any level of support. So how to explain this? And here is the two or three things that probably is my major argument, because I do believe it's less common than the explanation that normally you're going to hear. In order to understand the problem of Central Europe, do not think in terms of migration, think in terms of emigration. The demographic and moral panic that came with the migration crisis in places like Poland, Hungary, but even countries like Bulgaria, where the government was much more reasonable in its response. But if you go on the public opinion polls, you're going to see basically that the public stands not differently than in Central and European countries, is connected to four very specific factors, which are also going to be critical in the relations between East and West in the next years. First, demographic panic was the result of the fact that in these countries you have an aging population, shrinking population, and as a result of the emigration, this basically created a fear that some of these ethnic groups are going to disappear. Let's give you Bulgarian data. In 1989, the population of Bulgaria was slightly more than 8 million. Now, this is slightly more than 7 million, but according to the projections of the United Nations, in the next 30 years, we're going to lose 27% of the population. I hope this is not going to happen, but imagine how you're going to feel in a world in which you're seeing all this huge movement of people coming to Europe, and you're looking around, and you have the feeling that most of the young people that you're talking with are discussing, are they going to stay or are they going to leave the country? The impact of the people who left, and don't forget, there is a huge, in different countries it's different, and this is not connected even to the economic performance. The Baltic republics, which have a very stable and impressive economic performance, in the last 10 years, more than 10% of the population has left. And we are talking about the nations of 2-3 million people. Imagine what is this impact also not only on the political, on the social life, but on the political imagination. In Germany, the number of the people that have left certain regions for the last 30 years is a better predicator of who is going to vote for Alternative for Germany than the number of the refugees that has arrived. And for me, this is very important because I do believe that this is one of the major things that has changed. I know that there are different East Europeans in the room. I don't know, I could be wrong, but my feeling is that what has changed for the last 2 or 3 years was that East European societies, which for the last 20 years have been seeing the opening of the borders as the best thing that happened to us after 1989, started to fear the opening of the border not simply because of the fear of the foreigners coming, but also because of the fear of the depopulation. So you have a kind of a crisis that some of the rural areas have experienced in the 1960s and 70s when the modernization started. And if this is not going to be reversed, I do believe this explains some of the major political shifts that we see. And the second thing, which is also quite important in this respect, is that we're talking about many aspects in which East and West diverged. We talk about incomes for sure, people talk about values, all this, experiences. One of the major points of divergence is the actual state of ethnic diversity in these societies. Central and East European nation states, particularly Central Europeans, were very much the result of the ethnic cleansing that came after the end of the World War II. None of these countries should be blamed for this. It was not them who did the ethnic cleansing. But just to give you the figures, in 1939, around 40%, less than 40% of the population of Poland were non-Poles. There were Ukrainians, there were Germans, there were Jews. Now more than 95% of the population of Poland are Poles, at least citizens, because you have now quite a lot of Ukraine labor migrants. From this point of view, you have a society which has a much less experience with ethnic and cultural diversity for the last years. None of the Central and East European countries was a colonial empire. No colonial guilt there. No experience basically with the world outside of Europe. And I'm saying this because even if you go to the legacy of the 1968, which was quite important for the way Western and Eastern Europe has been made, 1968 in Western Europe was about the sovereignty of the individual. 1968 in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, was about the sovereignty of the nation. It was very much basically resisting the Soviet political presence in these countries. Why I'm saying all this? I'm saying all this because the fact that we have less migrants for the last year cannot be taken as that migration crisis is over or the political impact of the migration crisis is over. What the migration crisis did is for the Europeans to realize one basic change in the world, namely that in a world that is so connected and people know very much about what is happening almost in every corner of our world, but world which is totally unequal, where some people are living much better than others. If this is the case, and if you're living in a small and poor and badly governed country somewhere in Africa, what makes much more sense if you want to change your life? To change the government or to change the country? And it makes much more sense to change the country. So from this point of view, migration ends up as the 21st century revolution, but it's a revolution for which you don't need a political program, you don't need a political party, you need a courage, you should risk, you need Google Map. And as a result of it, the pressure on Europe was that suddenly, two questions that Europe was trying to discuss for good reasons for a long period came at the top of the agenda. Where are the borders of Europe? Who is in and who is out? And secondly, what kind of borders? Who is going to defend these borders? What is going to be? And we like euphemisms, smart borders, sharp borders, I don't know. We're going to find the word. But this is a very critical issue. Who is going to defend it and what is going to be the nature of the borders? I'm saying this and I'm going basically to finish was three brief arguments also on the nature of the problem that East and West in Europe are now facing. And there was a lot of talk about the rule of law, and Poland and Hungary have been mentioned. There is a tendency, and I don't have any sympathy for both governments, to make it clear. But basically, I do believe it's very important people not to create the illusion, because then disillusionment comes and it hurts most. There is a tendency first to reduce all the problems to a kind of a political accidents and very much to focus on the concrete political leaders, be Mr. Orban, be Mr. Kaczynski, and to try to explain everything through this. We, in my view, face a much more fundamental social and political shifts in some of these countries. Basically, when you talk to migration, imagine that Central and Eastern Europe, in a certain way, migrated in the West for the last 20, 25 years. And now you have the problem that you have with the second generation of migrants. Very well, by the way, explained in sociology literature. Nevertheless, that they are basically better integrated in a certain way. There is a much more resistance, go back to tradition, sensitivity, that you are treated as a second-class citizens, and so on and so on. We need also fundamentally to rethink certain type of processes that has happened in the last 25 or 30 years if you really are basically interested how to repair this relationship, which is politically not going to be easy at all. I'm saying this because now it's popular to say, if we can only imagine that in 30 years, Poland and Hungary are going to look the way they look. Listen, I'm doing something wrong, I knew. Yeah. If you're going to read articles being written in 91, 92, you're going to see that most of the people expected Poland and Hungary to look in the way they look now. There was a lot of fear about the rise of nationalism. There was a lot of fears basically connected with the fact that it is going to be very difficult to have market building, state building, and democracy building at the same time. Remember somebody like Klaus Hofer on the left and many people basically much more on the conservative right which are making this argument. So what happened in Central and Eastern Europe in the last 25 years was exceptional. It was not the rule. Something dramatically positive happened because of the European perspective, because, by the way, of the fear coming with what people saw during the dissolution of Yugoslavia, because of the kind of a strong incentive coming as a disintegration of the communist bloc. At the same time, 1989 revolution has one utopia, and this was the utopia of normality. The major story was, do not experiment. Future is not in front of us. Future is next to us. The future of Poland is Germany. The future of Bulgaria, I don't know, is Spain. I'm saying this because normally, in a time of a revolution, always a huge people are leaving the country. But there are normally people who hate this revolution. It was the White Russians. It was basically the monarchies in France. The paradox of 1989 is that most of the people who left were the people who mostly believed in this revolution. And this change is explaining the fact that in many of these countries you do not have a critical mass of people for the political and the social changes that are needed. You have kind of a missing generation. There was a beautiful Bulgarian joke on this, which I feel obliged to tell, because at least being in the presidency, we should supply not only ideas, but also jokes. And the joke is the following. 3 people dressed like Japanese samurais walk on the streets of Sofia. And the bystander is asking them, who are you? They said, we are the 7 samurais, and we are here to make this a better place. But why you only 3? The other 4 are working abroad. And I do believe this explains part of the problem that we are seeing. I want to end on this because I do believe that there is now going to be a very serious discussion about how to go with countries like Hungary, how to go with countries like Poland. And I know that now people are reading a lot in the public opinion polls and saying Hungarians and Poles, according to the opinion polls, are the most pro-European, and this is absolutely true. None of these countries wants to get out of the European Union. From this point of view, there are no Eurosceptical countries. But at the same time, and there is a lot of talk about use, I just want to keep you careful with two things. Do not generalize this type of a pro-European sentiment. The pro-European sentiment can also very much change. There is a certain type of a nationalistic moment which goes beyond governments, is on the level of society. For example, you can see the support for the government in Poland, which has been rising in the last years, and in the last months, and even the legislation like the anti-Holocaust legislations happen to be very popular with the Polish population. So you have a move in Europe in general from 1990s, where the stress was on the rights of minorities, to the stress on the rights of majorities. And this majoritarian moment is going to redefine democracies both East and West. And in my view, the big question with which I'm going to end up is how European Union is going to succeed and how it's going to find the solutions to its problem, keeping in mind that this majoritarian moment not simply is going to be present in most of the countries, but also that it is going to have a very different meaning in some of the countries, because there is one major difference between conservatism coming from the West and conservatism coming from the East. Western conservatism is very much post-68. In a certain way, it managed to internalize many of the social changes that has happened in all these years. It's not going to be strange to have a leader of a far-right party being openly gay. In Central and Eastern Europe, we are full package conservative. It goes on everything. And from this point of view, this conservative shift is not going to unite Europe politically. Paradoxically, it is going also to divide it. And some of the major debates is going to be by different conservatives on both sides and not simply between left and right and liberals and conservatives that we normally talk about. Let's end on this. I'm not pessimistic, nevertheless. The book was not called After Europe, it was a publisher's. It was called Perhapsburg, because I do believe it's an open-ended question. And I do believe that also political leadership matters. And from this point of view, one of the things that explains the optimism of 2017 was what happened in France. And what happened in France is that you have a political leader who managed to remarry the idea of change and the idea of European Union. Before Macron, to be pro-EU means to be pro-status quo. After Macron, you can be for a very radical change of what you see, at the same time your European credentials are still strong. I very much believe that this is this combination between demand for Europe and demand for change that is the best that we can hope for. Thank you very much.